Those are things that employers need to consider, especially when they're looking at resourcing talent in international markets, because when it comes down to making that offer to that employee, you need to make sure that you understand, what they already get from a legislative and governed type scenario. What are they already receiving? And then, okay, if we want to make it better, great, then let's make it better.
Good morning, HR. I'm Mike Coffey, president of Imperative, bulletproof background checks with fast and friendly service. And this is the podcast where I talk to business leaders about bringing people together to create value for shareholders, customers, and the community. Please follow, rate, and review Good Morning HR wherever you get your podcast. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, or at goodmorninghr.com. For several decades, America's economy has become increasingly more integrated with the rest of the world. Once the domain of giant multinational corporations, many smaller firms now have offices in other countries and even on other continents. Sometimes this is necessary because of access to natural resources or unique manufacturing opportunities, but increasingly, access to skilled labor across borders is leading many firms to open offices abroad. And during the pandemic, many employers realized that some or all of their employees' work could be done remotely. And many began to wonder whether, if the work could be done remotely in the next state over, why couldn't it be done in labor-rich markets around the world? But if you thought multi-state employment was complex, imagine complying with the labor and tax laws of other countries. Which brings me to Texas SHRM's Global Business Conference. This one-day conference will be held in Houston on September 19th. And joining me today to discuss global HR issues is the Global Business Conference's director, Meredith Morris. Meredith is the current director of international development with the firm Global Expansion, where her focus is educating and supporting international companies to align strategies and solutions to mobilize and hire people resources globally. She is a SHRM certified professional and also holds the Certified Relocation Professional and Global Mobility Specialist designations through the Worldwide Employee Relocation Council. Welcome to Good Morning HR, Meredith.
Oh my gosh, Mike, thank you so much for having me here today. And what a fantastic introduction you just did. Wow, you're making me feel like a superstar. I love it.
Well, you are. You are. And
thank you.
And you're the conference director, as I said, for the Texas SHRM Global Business Conference. Give me the elevator pitch for that conference.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for that. So our elevator pitch for the conference is we are the only global focused conference on HR and business issues in all of SHRM, including Texas SHRMs. So it's a one-day all global conference. So that's our elevator pitch.
And it's in Houston on September 19th. I'll be there.
I know. It's going to be great.
It's going to be super. And I'll have a link in the show notes so people can get more information and register.
Yeah, I know. I'm glad they're going to do that. Thank you for that, Mike. And I'm so glad you're going to be there to represent, right?
Yeah. And Texas SHRM is, we've done that. How many years has it been that Texas SHRM has sponsored this conference?
We are on year number 23.
Wow.
It started as, there is a history to everything, right? I feel like we kind of have to share the history because, it's a little known jewel in our community that, a lot of our professionals are not aware that this conference exists. And it's not a big conference. We keep it small, around like 200 professionals, so that everyone has an opportunity to network. But it really started as a concept by a small group of, global HR professionals that were seeking more global content that were relevant. So 23 years ago, a small group got together and said, this is something we need. They pitched it to Texas SHRM and it took off. And it's filled a very needed void, for content across different types of practitioners, in dealing with the global, even those that are new to global, like maybe they've just now moved into a new market, right? They're looking at expanding internationally, and then some of our more seasoned professionals and some of our larger organizations. that have huge global footprints.
And the sessions are approved for HRCI's GPHR credit.
Oh, yeah. So every session is approved for GPHR credit and, of course, our wonderful SHRM credits. So for the SHRM CP and the SHRM SCP, but definitely those that hold the GPHR, it's very difficult to find areas or concentrations in a single day where you can grab numerous credits towards your certification.
So let's talk about this cross-border employment. What situations lead U.S.-based companies to consider other countries' labor markets?
So, I guess when you're asking that question, Mike, when you're talking about talent in an organization, it really has to stem from what the strategy of the organization is, right? What is it that they're looking to do? Are they looking to offshore something? Are they really just looking for a specific skill set? Have they won a project? So it's not just cross-border. So cross-border, now that's becoming more common, right? But then when we're talking like internationally, a lot of companies are trying to source very hard to fill jobs, that have, long days to fill with talent in other markets, and especially maybe markets where they don't have an entity set up.
And so what kind of roles do you see most companies trying to fill on an international basis? Because obviously, unless I build a warehouse or a manufacturing facility, people who are doing tab A and slot A physical kind of work aren't going to be who I'm looking at. So what kind of roles generally are being filled on an international basis?
That's a really great question. And, my organization, and you already mentioned global expansion, but, for us as a PEO, specialized in employee of record, we fill all kinds of roles. So it really just depends, again, on that organization and what they're looking to accomplish. So many times it's opening a new manufacturing facility. It could be that they're doing a project, right? Maybe it's an infrastructure project. Maybe it is, DoD, government defense-based type, contracting work. It could be a financial institution, law firms. So, there's multiple different titles. I don't know that there's really one sector or one type of title or one type of job that companies are looking at sourcing on a global or even cross-border type situation. It really just depends on the need of the organization and what they're looking to accomplish. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing a lot more synergy and alignment in organizations with talent acquisition, between the business units, business lines, leaders, really trying to reinvent how they've done business and what they're going to do to meet those future needs of their organizations.
So let's say I'm an employer in the U.S. and I want to explore tapping into foreign labor markets. I mean, the first thing most people think about is H-1B visas and bringing somebody to the U.S. But in the past, we've had Dobrina Ustin and Kevin Lashus both on the podcast, both immigration attorneys, to talk about H-1Bs. And I mean, there's only 85,000 H-1B visas awarded each year, and that's for the entire country. So that's a very limited pool. And, there's a lot of paperwork and things involved with that. And that number hasn't changed since 1990. So it's a crazy number. And, given the state of our politics, it's probably not going to change anytime soon. So what are the other options that somebody who's looking at, okay, I need more labor, I'm not finding everything I need here, I want to look at alternatives to H-1B visas, though. What are their options?
So it's been a great topic, and it's one that, I have also covered with many organizations. So when we're talking about the H-1B, it is a difficult process because it's a lottery system, right? And they fixed some of the issues and, they've talked about it. But when you only have 85,000 or 80,000 of those and, you have 300 to 400,000 applications that come in.
And like the first 2 days, I mean, as soon as the lottery's over,
Your success rate, for that population that you're looking on that visa type is really tough. So what companies are doing, a couple of scenarios, sometimes they're parking them and what we call parking in like Canada, for example. So sometimes they will park this talent in another location, put them underneath another entity, especially if it's, it's somebody internationally wanting to come inbound into the US. If they go into the Canada market or into Mexico, then there's someone on a similar time zone as the US companies. They can park them in Canada, for example, for up to a year, maybe longer. And then within that year, they can start applying for their permanent residency in Canada. There are special programs that'll do that. We run a program like that for our clients. And then once they become a permanent resident of Canada, it's much easier to cross them over into the US. But the other thing that companies are doing is that if they do find specific talent, and I'm actually working with a couple of organizations right now where they have some very specific role sets, they have identified some talent in an international market, they're actually going ahead and onboarding that talent, hiring them in, let's say, Bulgaria, because it's a specific talent, or Germany or France or wherever that location may be. They're bringing them on as an employee under an EOR scenario. They can go ahead and start integrating that employee while they're still working to get their visa settled out into the US. So we become a temporary stopgap so they can at least grab that talent, hire that talent, train that talent. And even though that talent's working remotely, then they're still working on their visa applications, finding the right visa type in order to immigrate them into the US in order to come to work for the organization, whether it's a long-term assignment or a temporary type situation or a permanent one-way move. So, those are just some of the different scenarios when you're talking about H-1B specifically.
Okay. Yeah. But, and if we're not talking about bringing that person physically to the country, I assume we can still, do the employer of record process, which I want to get into more. But what's the disadvantage of just creating an entity in that country?
I think it's really just a personal preference. And typically what we tell companies or what we work with them on and consult is that, many companies, the traditional way, let's just go ahead and use the resources. Let's open an entity. Let's hire one person. Let's see how the market works, market expansion. And then maybe that market doesn't take off like it should have. And you've invested a lot. And opening an entity, some countries is a little bit easier than other countries. I can't say that they're all going to be speedy fast. I mean, I don't open entities all day long. But what I do know conceptually is that companies will lay that process down, potentially use an employer of record, and then they can hire that one person in that country. And then once it gets off the ground and they get a certain number of employees, they'll go ahead and start that process to open the entity. And let's even say it is a decided market. Like the company's made a decision, okay, we're going to be moving into Brazil, period. We're opening up an entity. We're going to move there. That may be a market that it could take 6 months to a year, but they might have client needs or desire to go ahead and get started. So many times they'll use an employee of record in order to go ahead and get market entry, legally have their people working on the ground and compliantly. Taxes are paid to the local authorities. So, that tax governance piece, permanent establishment, is mitigated, but it allows the company a faster speed to market entry while they spend that time and resources to open up the entity properly. And then once they have it open, we just transfer them back their employees.
And so depending on what country it is and all the hoops you have to jump through to open an entity, and whether that country even allows foreign ownership of entities and what that involves, all those kinds of things.
Exactly.
They could do an employer of record, which we'll get to, but as the bridge until they create that. And depending on the expense and the local laws and things like that, I imagine there's obviously a cost to that. So you have to hit a critical mass of number of employees before it even makes sense to do that, probably.
I would say so.
Yeah.
But again, I talk to companies all day long, and it really just depends on the risk tolerance of the organization, what's their anticipated, footprint, what are they really looking to achieve with such strategies? And, everyone's strategy is different. Everyone's purpose is different, but sometimes having that flexibility and other solutions, to allow for that expansion or allow for that quick market entry or allow for that project to take place place, or to test that market out. Companies are looking at new ways of really trying to meet those goals.
So why not just hire these? And I'm asking a facetious question almost, but I mean, just like we see with U.S. employers and multi-state and situations, and
Yeah.
why not just hire these people as independent contractors and just pay them under the table or something like that? Are there risks there, or is it just vary from country to country, or what's the issue there?
Well, no, companies do it every day.
Oh, okay.
So it's a very common practice, that independent worker, that contractor, are maybe using a large firm that will supply contract labor to them. That's a very common practice and has been around for a really long time. I think when it comes to the independent contractor, there's always that risk of misclassification. And so a lot of companies, what they're doing, and, I hear the story all day long, well, we haven't been caught yet. We've been doing this, we have this individual. And what ends up happening, we have, a rule of thumb. It doesn't mean that anybody has to follow it, but typically we say, like, okay, if you're directing 25% of the work, and this is an independent contractor, great. It really kind of falls in that bucket where that risk for misclassification is minimal. I mean, I'm not going to say it doesn't exist because, that's not my realm of expertise. But when you start directing 100% of the work, you're supplying the laptop, you're supplying the login. They have somebody that is directing their work, that they report to, that is managing their time, that is managing their work, that is giving them performance reviews. They are no longer a contractor. And many companies are doing that on this independent labor. And so you have this, potential for a misclassification and for the individual to come back and say, I'm not a contractor, I'm a full-time employee, and I should be getting all of the same benefits that everybody else in my country gets because they're directing 100% of the work. Let me show you, and I can prove it. So, there's really just a fine line, and it's still a very gray area, but it's still a common practice. And again, it really just depends on the specific needs of the organization and their tolerance of risk.
And I know Mexico, Canada, those are two that I have the most experience with, have very different employment laws than the U.S. does, and much more legislatively defined benefit structures, what's available for vacation, sick time. They've all got their own leave policies, and they have paid leave in some cases. I think it's just like independent contractors in the U.S. Everything's fine while everybody's happy. And I imagine most of the time employers get burned when somebody decides that, well, this employer is not treating me well, or they fire me. So I go down and file unemployment or whatever the claim is in this country and say this U.S. company is, I worked for them. What do you mean? They owe this tax. What do you mean I don't have benefits? And suddenly now the employer's dealing with probably a very expensive situation with a foreign regulator.
Potentially. Absolutely. There's always being, caught and fined, for corporate tax that wasn't paid in the country. Potential lawsuits from the employee. I mean, I think there's all kinds of different scenarios that could take place. But, as you mentioned, every country, how they operate, their laws, their taxes, what the employees get, what benefits they get, it varies. It's not the same. And, and I work with a lot of U.S. side companies that think that U.S. side benefits can transfer over into an international market. So, I mean, like 401k. Okay, we want to give this employee, we want to give them 401k. I'm like, okay, well, 401k just doesn't really exist in other international markets. So we have to find a different solution. Maybe it's a pension fund. So those are things that employers need to consider, especially when they're looking at resourcing talent in international markets, because when it comes down to making that offer to that employee, you need to make sure that you understand, what they already get from a legislative and governed type scenario. What are they already receiving? And then, okay, if we want to make it better, great, then let's make it better. That's fine. And I'll give you an example. I was actually working with a company. They're doing their first international hire, and they're like, okay, we want to give this person 9 paid holidays. And I was like, okay, but they get 12. They're like, but we only want to pay for 9. I'm like, See, no, you can't. It's 12. They get 12. It's governed by law, and here are the 12 holidays, and that's what you have to recognize. Now, if you want to give them extra holidays, you can do that. But you can't mandate, oh, I want to give them this many holidays, or I want to give them this much time off, because they may already be allowed, let's say, 15 days as part of that requirement in country. Okay, well, we only want to give them 10. Okay, well, you can't.
Yeah.
You can give him 15, and then if you want to give him an extra 10, you can. Really, so those are a lot of the elements. Just not even going down the tax path or anything else. So that's just basics.
And let's take a quick break. Good Morning HR is brought to you by Imperative, bulletproof background checks with fast and friendly service. On August 23rd, I'm hosting a webinar entitled Background Check Mythbusters. I've set aside an hour to tackle common misconceptions and questions about employers' use of criminal history, off-duty conduct, background checks, and state-specific laws. Many of the topics are things I commonly encounter in conversations with HR professionals or see posted on social media. This webinar will be pre-approved for an hour of recertification credit by both HRCI and SHRM. But do you have a nagging question you've never had a clear answer to, or were embarrassed to ask? There are no dumb questions. Well, yeah, there are, but I know yours won't be. Send me your questions when you register for the webinar at imperativeinfo.com. Also, I promise it won't be a sales job. I've learned over the last 25 years that our best marketing is simply trying to be helpful to the rest of our HR community. If you're an HRCI or SHRM certified professional, this episode of Good Morning HR has been pre-approved for 1/2 hour of recertification credit. To obtain the recertification information, visit goodmorninghr.com and click on Research Credits. Then select episode 161 and enter the keyword GLOBAL. That's GLOBAL. And if you're looking for even more recertification credit, check out the webinars page at imperativeinfo.com. And now back to my conversation with Meredith Morris. So let's say we decide we don't want to create an entity and we don't want to take the risk of independent contractors. So we go to an employer of record. What's the difference, I guess, between what we can traditionally think of in the U.S. as a PEO versus an employer of record, or are they the same thing, basically?
Yeah, so our vertical is PEO. So we're a professional employment organization, just like banking is under banking, legal is under legal. So we're considered a PEO. That's the vertical that we range in, but not all PEOs are the same. So you have some that are payroll only, like your big players in the market. And then you have a company like mine, Global Expansion, where we solely focus on employer of record services. There are sometimes, we may do some like local payroll depending on what that situation looks like, but our specialty is employer of record. And what that means is that this is not just a payroll. What we're doing is that if there's an organization that does not have an entity open in a foreign location where they're wanting to hire locals or move expats into that specific market, we can hire them underneath the local entity and employ them on that employer's behalf. And we payroll them, and we will manage their benefits, and we can manage their time off. We put their employment contracts together. We make sure all the taxes are paid within country and any social burdens. And we make sure that we're managing per law in country. So we act as like an extension of the international HR department. And it can be confusing because they're like, oh, okay, well, then they're not our employees. I'm like, no. They're your employees. They're just under a different brand. But the employer is still managing the employee. They're still dictating the work. They're still doing the performance reviews. They can still manage the time off if they want to. This person still reports to a direct line manager. So they're still their employee. It just gives the companies an alternate means in order to hire these people in that market.
So just to make sure that I'm clear, in your case, let's say Global Expansion or any of these PEOs
any
or
of them.
EORs,
EORs.
Employers of record, they have, you've already have an entity in this foreign country most of the time.
There's an entity in market that's utilized.
And then So 15 different U.S. based companies, employees could be under that entity. They never talk to each other or have any interaction. It's just on paper. Y'all are taking the responsibility for making sure taxes are paid and payroll's done, and that the laws, whatever the laws
Yes,
are there, you're just handling that compliance. So,
that's
uh,
correct.
do does global expansion or do EORs typically do anything to help manage people? Like like if I've got a PEO in the US and I've got a management problem, I've got a performance problem with an employee, I can turn to the PEO and they can often help, rectify that situation or something like that. Do y'all do that, or typically is that left to the employer directly?
It's really the client's decision. It's really up to the client. But, the one element I would say is that, if there's an employee that they've hired, because remember, these are their people, they hand selected them. They're
Hmm.
there. I mean, they picked them. They hired them. They relocated them. They're the company's employees. They're not mine. Technically, on
Right.
paper, they're mine, but they
Right.
still remain underneath that direction. So, really, the client has to drive how that takes place. So, if there needs to be certain discussions, but the element that becomes really critical is that they can't terminate the person without interacting with us, because we have to make sure that we're following the law of the country and that they're aware of what those practices are. And so we guide organizations through that and consult with them so that they understand if they do have that type of issue with a specific professional that, may not be the right fit that they've hired in a local market. At least we can guide them through the right elements of how to deal with this. And then what that back end cost is going to look like from an employer perspective, because sometimes there are severances that have to be paid out, vacation time that has to be paid out. There could be, a 60 or 90-day notice period that has to be given. So those are elements that we guide our clients on a consistent basis.
Well, they're your employees then, on paper at least, but you get this. I'm seeing it as the entrepreneur in the room, and it's making me crazy thinking about this is like any other PEO. I guess you're accepting a certain amount of responsibility
Hmm.
that your client isn't an idiot, right? And that they're going to follow what you tell them as the law, and they're not going to get you sued. Because I assume, as the PEO itself would have some concern for making sure, you know, there's probably all kinds of cultural expectations and things that may be recognized not in the letter of the law, but certainly the expectation of courts and juries. God forbid you ever get that far. Um,
Yeah.
so y'all, how do you mitigate that? How does the PEO, and you don't have to talk about global expansion specifically, but how do you generally mitigate? Because I'm sure all your clients are beautiful and intelligent, just like mine. But how does a PEO mitigate that liability internationally?
It starts with the actual contractual terms. And, all of that's set up, especially when it comes to the liability. How is that going to work? How is this process going to happen? How are we going to manage that? And so we feel like if we manage the partnership in the beginning, and that all, the organizations understand how the relationship is going to work, then at that point, that partnership becomes one that's very solid. And communication is key. So, and again, you only know what you know. I mean, just like most everyone I speak to, they think I know every in-country law in
Wow.
214 different countries and territories. I really wish I did, because I'd be rich. And I really would, because I would know everything. But I don't. And so the reality is that we have to utilize those experts and work as a team and as a partner, so that together we mitigate those risks. And, it's not easy doing international. And you can ask a lot of these big global companies, they know, and even small companies starting to delve into it. It's complex, and it takes a team.
And I can imagine you're working with local legal counsel,
Yes.
accounting and finance people who understand all the intricacies of that, all those things that, well, I mean, quite honestly, that most companies have to deal with in the US, and you're replicating those systems. But you've got people on the ground that you trust and that you've got experience with. So when, the US based employer doesn't have to go over there and create all of that from scratch.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. And, even when we do the employment contracts, because every person that comes on board with us, they sign an employment contract. And the employment contract's in English in the local language. But, then we can make some changes to the employment contract, but then the employee's signing that so that there's clarity in the very beginning with these professionals of what that employment's going to look like, what's being offered, what the regulations are, and how this process is going to work. So again, it's really just education, communication, partnership, and clarity. Clarity from all sides, really, to make sure that you started off on the right foot. I think that's like with any business.
And so we get where we're ready to hire somebody,
Right.
or we want to fill a position. Does the employer of record generally do the recruiting? Who's looking at the in Turkey, the Indeed of Turkey, whatever that is, and trying to find this engineer or whatever? Who generally does that recruiting and selection? I can imagine you've got translation issues and all kinds of things.
Yeah, from our perspective, as far as our organization and all companies are different,
Sure.
we don't do the recruiting. So we're not a recruiting firm, we're not a staffing firm, and that's not our specialty. Now we work with partners that we
Mhm.
recommend, but
Okay.
most organizations that we deal with, one, they'll either have an in-house recruitment team, which is great. Two, they probably have a recruiting firm that, that they've built some type of relationship with, or
That
that
works
can.
overseas in that
Right,
area. Okay.
exactly. Or the third means is that, we'll connect them with a local team or a global type provider where they can source that talent. So, and then we work closely with them as they continue to move through those candidates. So then we know where they're at in the process and we know when their start date is so that we can start putting those employment contracts together and getting ready to onboard them for their start date and have them start. But yes, I mean, for our model, now other employer records, some of them actually do staffing and recruiting. Some of them run into these other lines and, they're competing in that specific space and then they're offering this as well. So, every one of us run our operations just a little bit differently.
So those are things that a company needs to, an employer, a U.S. based company needs to be asking and trying to figure out all those details about who's liable for what, how, who's responsible for whatever we need done, and how do we go about doing that.
Exactly. It depends on how their process is because we're not asking anyone to change the process. If we need to help them, and support them in different ways, great, then we can. But otherwise, we're really here just to assist in that process and supplement to help them meet their strategic goals.
And you mentioned earlier in passing the risk of permanent establishment in a country,
Mhm.
and I think what that means is that you've got enough business in that country that they're going to be looking at you like you're, a French company or an EU-based company or a company in Turkey or wherever, and have some application of Turkish law and tax law and everything else apply to you. Are there circumstances where an employer in the U.S. working through an employer of record may still risk permanent establishment just because of the size of their workforce or something like that?
Potentially, you can never erase that risk, even with an employer of record. I would like to say we could 100% guarantee it, but there's no guarantee in any country or any market. What we do know is that the process and the way that we layer and how we employ, our professionals on their behalf, it mitigates the risk.
Interesting. Okay. So yeah, because I know, you read every day about some US tech company getting nailed by the EU governing bodies for, these Byzantine requirements that they've got. And so if they're not coming for you yet under this EOR, it'll be a matter of time before they try to find another way to tax or collect. I mean, government, that's what government's good at, right? So, I'm sure that's something that all your local legal counsel and everybody else is always watching to make sure that okay, this little change in the law is happened, and we have to reevaluate what it means to all our current contracts.
Yeah, sending your business travelers in on tourist visas, performing work
Oh yeah.
consistently over a 6-month time frame, they're
Hmm.
probably eventually going to get caught.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
thinking that you can use these digital nomad visas that are meant for tourist type
Hmm.
situations or, Schengen tourist type visas, for the Schengen area, but you're going
Right.
in and working for clients, eventually you're going to get tagged. And it's only because of the immigration system and they've gotten smarter and everything's electronic. And now they can really track your employees. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I've even seen that happen in Canada.
Oh, yeah.
I've got a good friend who owns her business. She does training, really specific kinds of sales training, and she had a Canadian-based client who she was always here doing work for them remote, doing online training, things like that. But they asked her to come speak at one of their conferences, and she's crossing the Canadian border, and they routinely asked her, why are you coming across? And she didn't even think twice about it. Oh, I'm coming to speak at this conference for one of my clients. And they walked her right back across the border. I mean, it was and barred her from returning for some period of time. I mean, it was they were hard nosed about it, and she was shocked just because I'm just going to speak at a conference. And so, but so I can imagine, and Canadians are the nice people. So there's places around the world that had to be even harder, right? So to wrap up, one of the big issues that we talk about even in the U.S. are cultural issues and dealing with diversity and all of that. I can only imagine how much harder that is when you're dealing with a U.S. based manager and employees in another country. What are common kind of cultural issues that employers encounter, and what's typically the prescription for trying to resolve that?
That's a really great question because you're right. I mean, people work differently globally, right? Not all culture is the same. We don't all work the same. And so, really trying to understand those nuances is important. And you asked me the question, I would say, understanding that culture and how they operate as a business before making that decision to start hiring those individuals. Because, there could be cultures where, it's really about, where your ranking is within the company, what your title is, and then how that sequence of reporting goes.
Mm.
So you could have like a group meeting and maybe a less senior individual would be hesitant to speak during that meeting, whereas a more senior one typically does all of the talking. So I think that knowing that there's different nuances and being able to understand that and listen. And there actually are companies out there that do cultural training for businesses, and they teach them business etiquette and both sides. Okay. It's not just the US side, but it's also culturally on your employees that are in those specific markets as well, and immersion training.
So that
So,
they understand what, when they're talking to this guy from Texas, they understand what I'm talking about.
yeah.
Okay, interesting.
The hardest, and I would say the hardest thing to do is that a lot of times, especially we as Texans, we'll say things like, I mean, we have these little innuendos and we'll say different things like, that's not my first rodeo. And they're
Right,
like,
yeah.
what do you mean? What kind
Yeah.
of rodeo?
What,
Where did
yeah.
they rodeo? What's a rodeo? But what we really meant to say is, that's not my first time having that specific experience.
Right.
So learning how you use your language, that's like really big too. Because even like my UK counterparts, I can tell you when I started with this organization and I was on a call with one of our people and he's sitting there and he's talking like, smart shoes and, the like jumpers. And I was like, jumpers and smart shoes? Like, what do you
And the
mean?
car is wearing a boot. What do you
Yeah,
mean the car is wearing has a boot? What? Yeah.
right.
Well, and in the English, my sister married a Brit, and who I love because he gave me an amazing nephew. But they state facts as questions. They'll say something and then they'll say, "Isn't it?" And I don't know if I'm supposed to answer, "Yeah, it is," or is that just rhetorical? And so, yeah, those kind of things
Yeah.
it just happens. Yeah.
Yeah, it just happens. So realizing that your language really and how you formulate your sentences and words that you say, it truly is. I mean, it's truly a different experience. So yeah,
Yet
be
another
careful of
reason to
that.
work with an expert who understands that country and can help guide both parties through that. It's like,
100%. Of course. Yes.
well, Meredith, that's all the time. That's our half hour.
I
We're
love
up.
that.
Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, Mike. And thank you so much for promoting the Texas SHRM Global Business Conference, September 19th. And thank you for allowing me to be here today. I enjoyed this time with you.
It was fun.
It was fun.
And you can get more information about the Texas SHRM Global Conference on September 19th at texas.shrmglobalconference.org. And again, it'll be in the show notes. And thank you for listening. You can comment on this episode or search our previous episodes at goodmorninghr.com or on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, or TikTok. And don't forget to follow us wherever you get your podcasts. Rob Upchurch is our technical producer, and you can reach him at robmakespods.com. And thank you to Imperative's marketing coordinator, Marianne Hernandez, who keeps the trains running on time. And I'm Mike Coffey. As always, don't hesitate to reach out if I can be of service to you personally or professionally. I'll see you next week, and until then, be well, do good, and keep your chin up.